Good morning and welcome to all of you for this second session of the International Scene lecture series. Many of you know that this series, which has been running for decades, is part of the Institute for Peace Studies, which in turn is part of the Center for Civic Engagement. And again, some of you know about all of these initiatives and projects, but for those of you that don't, one of the signature events of the Center for Civic Engagement is coming up October 23rd, which is Wednesday. And so we'd invite all of you to come. It's a rather big feast of panels, presentations, all kinds of dialogue, deliberative dialogue about the urgent issues of the times, both local and international issues. So please come to that. I think most of there's information in the back, I hope. And if not, you can find it in Hofstra online. Again, a wide array of talks and events, clearly focused very much on the upcoming election, whether or not foreign policy, local issues, environmental issues, reproductive issues, all of the above. So please stay politically fit and come to those events on Wednesday, October 23rd. For those of you I don't know, I'm Linda Longmire. I'm a professor in the Global Studies and Geography Department, and along with Professor Marty Melkonian, Professor Carolyn Eisenberg, one of the co-directors of this series. And again, probably there's never been a more urgent time. Well, we always think the time we're in is the most urgent, but I think it might be as a species with the growing threats, war in various places around the world, and of course the key role that the United States plays, and which is why it's so important to understand American foreign policy. In any case, we are delighted to welcome our speaker today. Let me tell you a little bit about the format before we begin. And excuse me, I'm getting over a cough. It's not contagious, but it's lingering. So if I get a coughing fit, just send health vibes this way, and I'll try to recuperate. In any case, we are delighted. Today we'll hear from our speaker, as well as then commentary by two of our distinguished faculty, Professor Carolyn Eisenberg, who is an expert in foreign policy, as well as Professor David Green from the Political Science Department, who is also an expert in international politics. So we are always grateful for their participation and insight and commentary. Again, we're tackling important, urgent, perhaps species existential crises today in the world. And it's important to remember that, particularly in a university setting, we honor a diversity of opinions. What's important is we see our campus as one great debate space. And so whether or not any one event has a particular critique or contribution or perspective, we like to look at things as a whole semester of dialogue, debate, diverse opinions about, and passionate opinions about these issues. So in that spirit, again, we look forward to your questions and commentaries, always respectful, of course, as well as priority given, of course, to tuition-paying students. And there is a mic here in the center. So the format will be roughly that we will we'll hear first from our guest speaker, who we're delighted to welcome, for about 20-25 minutes, then a brief 5-minute commentary from Professor Green, and then from Professor Eisenberg, and then we'll open it up to your questions, comments, and reactions. So again, always in a spirit of respect, however diverse, but it's very important, again, to remember that in these heated times especially. So I always go back in this spirit to my favorite, Antonio Gramsci, who talked about how we have to cultivate pessimism of the mind, but optimism of the will. And I believe our guest today really embodies that spirit. Again, pessimism of the mind does not mean being depressed about things, though certainly these are rather depressing times, but it means thinking critically, and after all, that's what college is about. Thinking critically, realistically facing, as opposed to denying the real problems that exist, the real injustices that exist, but acting with optimism and perhaps even with community solidarity and joy. Too often these things, particularly I know as college students, can become overwhelming. So very important that, again, we stay politically fit, we think critically, but that we also know that in a democracy, as citizens, it's important to act. Speaking of which, voting is coming up. Good news is that Hofstra, for the first year, will enable you to vote on campus. So please, you know the phrase, use it or lose it. Make sure that you exercise your ability to vote in this very critical upcoming election. So without further ado, I want to welcome our speaker today, Aaron Maté, who is a journalist, a producer. You can hear more about his work on the show, the podcast. The journalist is Pushback with Aaron Maté. Am I right, Aaron?
Mm-hmm.
And it's on the Grayzone. Again, so important to have these critical perspectives, and the use of the new technology, I think, is very constructive in this way. He sometimes fills in as a host on the Useful Idiots podcast. Again, lots of creativity, but you also might have heard his work on Democracy Now!, on Vice, the Real News Network, and Al Jazeera. He's also contributed to The Nation. He obviously has a perspective, and one that we feel is important to hear. And he comes from a very interesting journey, very interesting background, comes from a very interesting family. I just had a message from, as I mentioned to Aaron, from a friend of mine who recently heard his brother speak in Dublin. And of course, his father is a well-known physician, and his mother is an illustrator of children's books. So a big concentration of talent in this family. But while he was a student back in Montreal, he also led pro-Palestinian student protests. It was a union. So again, this is not something that he comes to, a perspective or an issue that he comes to recently. You might even want to, is it okay to mention the film about his activism?
I've tried to erase that film from my memory, but
okay,
so be it.
All right, so maybe I won't mention. Discordia, it's called.
Yeah.
And really talks again about the spirit of activism, student activism, and the importance of students being able to speak out, to, again, think critically, in order to not only learn about the world, but to work that political muscle that makes democracy alive, vital, and despite its precarious situation at the moment. I guess when you're raising important questions when you get death threats. So I guess that's part of the difficulty of speaking critically very often. But again, this is not something he comes to recently. A person that some of you probably follow, Naomi Klein, and he's worked with her and for her as a researcher, praised him as saying, a great intellect and a terrific journalist. So we are really delighted that he's here to speak to us about not only American foreign policy, but also the urgency of this critical historical moment. So welcome. Please join me in welcoming Aaron Maté.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you to Hofstra University for hosting me. It's great to see everybody turn out. It's conventional wisdom that foreign policy doesn't play a major role in U.S. presidential elections. And there's many reasons why that's unfortunate. First of all, just at the most basic level, foreign policy is the area where the role of the president is most paramount. That's where the president has most independence to pursue policy. A lot of it is done at their discretion as opposed to domestic policy where the president acts in accordance with Congress and the courts. But foreign policy really is the domain of the White House. And so therefore, it'd be great to be having a debate about it in such a consequential election. The second reason why it's unfortunate that there's that foreign policy does not play such a major role in a presidential election is that the U.S. is currently playing a vital role in two of the world's worst crises. Whatever you think of the U.S. role in Ukraine and in Israel, Palestine, Middle East, the U.S. role is instrumental. And both these conflicts, again, no matter your perspective on them, we can all agree are extremely dangerous and volatile. So if ever there were a time for debate, it would be now. But I suspect that part of the reason why there isn't that much debate over foreign policy in presidential elections is because actually when you look at the two parties, you see so much overlap in policy that while they have plenty of differences on domestic issues, on foreign policy, I would argue, and I'll say more about this in a bit, the U.S. government acts as sort of a uniparty. And I'm going to argue today that this uniparty is firmly on the side of fomenting war, fomenting conflict, and undermining all possibilities for a peaceful resolution to both these conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, for the goal simply of advancing U.S. hegemony. That's the case I'll make to you today. Now, both these conflicts, Ukraine war, Middle East, a lot of differences, and I'm not trying to equate the two, but there are some overlapping themes. And one of them is, I think, very critical. If you listen to how our top officials, whether it's on the Republican side or on the Democratic side, how they discuss these conflicts, you will hear the same word to describe the seminal events that are associated with these conflicts. So October 7th, what is the word we always hear about Hamas's operation against Israel? Is that it was unprovoked. Hamas's unprovoked attack on Israel on October 7th. And what is the word we also hear about Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022? It was unprovoked. Now, I'm going to argue that that's false in both cases. And to argue against the argument that these were unprovoked incidents is not to try to justify them. It's simply to try to explain them and come up especially with solutions, especially given, I believe, the U.S. has played a critical role in both. And I think the purpose of the term unprovoked, in part, is to actually completely whitewash the critical U.S. role in both of these issues, and therefore to foreclose very meaningful possibilities for a peaceful resolution in which we could play a very critical part. So let's start with Israel-Palestine, which is, dominating the news right now, threatening a wider conflagration as we're awaiting a potential Israeli attack on Iran after Iran launched strikes on Israel recently in retaliation for a series of Israeli strikes against Iran, including the Israeli bombing of a Iranian diplomatic consulate in Damascus in April, followed by the assassination of a Hamas leader in Tehran just over a month ago. So this notion that history begins on October 7th and that Hamas just woke up one day and decided to attack Israel because it hates Jews and it wasn't provoked. Well, to make that argument, which is very standard in U.S. discourse, is to ignore decades of history. And there's no time today to go through it all, but let me just try to do a very brief summary in the limited time that I have. So going back to the early 20th century, you had a movement called Zionism that wanted to create a state for the Jewish people. Now, as a side note, the Zionist movement was actually very diverse. You had people like Ahad Hayam who wanted to create a homeland for Jews, but did not want to do so at the expense of anybody else. So Ahad Hayam envisioned a national home for Jewish people that would celebrate Jewish life, Jewish culture, but wouldn't privilege Jews at the expense of other people. Unfortunately, Ahad Hayam did not win out this argument, and the strand of Zionism that won out and was created in Palestine was that which wanted to create a Jewish state in which Jews had superior rights, and also a state that came in a land that was already populated with people, namely the Arabs of Palestine, as it was called at the time. Somebody who recognized this was a very influential Zionist leader named Zev Jabotinsky, who I recently learned actually was a good friend of my great-grandfather's. And Jabotinsky wrote this. He wrote this in the 1920s, years before Israel was created. He said, "Every indigenous people will resist alien settlers as long as they see any hope of ridding themselves of the danger of foreign settlement." He concluded, therefore, that this is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. Zionism, he therefore concluded, is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces. Other Zionists agreed with him. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, he argued, quote, that the rights which the Jewish people has been adjudged in Palestine do not depend on the consent and cannot be subjected to the will of the majority of its present inhabitants. As Benny Morris put it, a prominent Israeli historian who did more than anybody to document the Nakba, which was the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians upon the creation of Israel in 1948. Benny Morris wrote that Zionism was a colonizing and expansionist ideology and movement intent on politically and even physically dispossessing and supplanting the Arabs. And accordingly, when Israel was created, Zionist forces expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and never allowed them to return. This was recognized by early Israeli leaders. For example, Moshe Dayan, one of Israel's most famed military leaders, he said this at a funeral in 1956 for an Israeli soldier who was killed by Palestinians living in Gaza. He said this: "Let us not cast the blame on the murderers today. Why should we deplore their burning hatred for us? For 8 years, they have been sitting in the refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes we have been transforming the lands and villages where they and their fathers dwelt into our estate." So Dayan said that in 1956, and note there how he said for 8 years they've been sitting in the refugee camps of Gaza. Well, now we're at nearly 80 years, and that foundational expansionism of Zionism has only gotten worse, far worse. 1967, Israel fully occupies the West Bank and Gaza. 1982, it invades Lebanon with the aim of destroying the PLO. The official pretext is that the PLO was rocketing northern Israel, when in reality, as was recognized by Israeli officials at the time, the problem with the PLO in the Israeli eyes was that the PLO was moving towards the global consensus of a two-state solution, in which Palestinians would get just 22% of their historic homeland, a state in the West Bank and Gaza, with a capital in East Jerusalem. And for Israel, which is, as we've seen, bent on expansion and domination, now even that Palestinian compromise was unacceptable. And so that's why Lebanon was invaded in 1982. In the process, tens of thousands of people were killed. That's when Hezbollah was formed to resist Israeli aggression. Then you have the years of the so-called peace process, in which Israel and the PLO start negotiating for a Palestinian state. But rather than grant Palestinians that state that they've accepted in just 22% of their land, Israel only expands the illegal settlements in the West Bank that make a Palestinian state impossible. And they do all this with the full support of the U.S., which was posing as an honest broker for Middle East peace, when really, as is now very clear from the record, acting as Israel's lawyer. Leading up to, fast-forwarding a lot, finally in 2005, Israel realizes that it's kind of costly to maintain control of two separate sets of Palestinian territory, the West Bank and Gaza. What they really care about is the West Bank. That's where the major West Bank settlements are, and that's where, most importantly, valuable water reserves are. So Israel decided that it wasn't worth all the international condemnation and controversy about occupying two sets of Palestinian land. And so, in 2005, they withdrew their settlers from Gaza and left it behind and focused on just colonizing the West Bank. Now, the conventional narrative there is that after Israel left Gaza, its settlers, that the occupation ended and that Gaza had the chance to turn itself into the Singapore of the Middle East, but chose terror instead. In reality, Israel immediately put Gaza under siege, controlling everything that comes in and out. When Palestinians, a few years later, elected Hamas in parliamentary elections, Israel and the U.S. responded by putting Gaza under a full blockade. Now, why did Hamas win those elections? Because their alternative was the Palestinian Authority, which had been the face of the so-called peace process that, rather than giving Palestinians a state, had only accelerated further expansion of Israeli settlements. And also in the process, the PA became very corrupt. So the only alternative was Hamas, which, while being fundamentalist and having, really reactionary views, was not known as being very corrupt and was seen as being an actual beacon of resistance to Israel. So given that choice, that's pretty much the reason why Hamas won that election. Israel responds by putting Gaza under siege. As one Israeli official explained, Israel was in such control of Gaza despite withdrawing that they could control what could come in and out, and therefore could control how many calories each Palestinian consumed. And they calculated the exact number of calories that they could allow each Palestinian in Gaza to consume without causing a full-blown starvation crisis. This is what he said. Their aim, quote, is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger. So under Israeli control, where Israel's choosing how many calories each Palestinian can consume, over 90% of Gaza's water became unfit for human consumption. In 2018, the UN declared that conditions in Gaza were so dire that the territory could become uninhabitable within years. And this Israeli siege on Gaza is accompanied by periodic military assaults that killed, wounded, and displaced tens of thousands of Palestinians. Now, throughout this period, you also hear, okay, fine, yes, the occupation is bad, but where are the Palestinian Mandelas? Why aren't they, rather than Hamas firing rockets into Israel, why aren't they protesting peacefully? Well, Palestinians did just that in Gaza. In 2018, the same year, there was something called the Great March of Return. Tens of thousands of Palestinians from all walks of life marched peacefully, calling for their basic rights, calling for an end to the blockade that had kept them trapped in what even a very famous Israeli sociologist, Baruch Kimmerling, described as the world's largest open-air prison and the world's largest concentration camp. How did Israel respond to this Great March of Return, this peaceful protest? With sniper rifles gunning people down, aiming for limbs, maiming people, paralyzing them, killing journalists, killing paramedics. That was the that was the Israeli response. And what did the world do? We all yawned. What did the U.S. do? This is under Donald Trump. Trump gave it his full approval. He recognized Israel's theft of the Syrian Golan Heights, which it occupied in 1967. He moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. And not a peep was raised about Israel gunning down peaceful people in Gaza calling for their basic rights. Fast forward to the period before October 7th. And the Netanyahu government comes to power, and they reiterate the long-standing Israeli policy that basically refuses to grant Palestinians equal rights and sees all the land from the river to the sea as being one for Jewish sovereignty, for Jewish control. And this is why Netanyahu said many years ago, when the Arab League offered him full peace if Israel withdrew from the occupied territories and let a Palestinian state exist in the West Bank and Gaza, Netanyahu said, we will never negotiate on those terms. So he's basically saying we'll never allow a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu turned to a policy of actually propping up Hamas because he recognized that supporting this militant fundamentalist group in Gaza would serve his goal of undermining a Palestinian state. This is what he reportedly told a cabinet, a meeting of fellow party members in March 2019. Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. And when Netanyahu's government in December 2022 formalized its policy, the guiding policy, it said, is that, quote, the Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right to all parts of the land of Israel. This included Gaza, a cabinet minister explained in March of 2023, so before October 7th. This cabinet minister, Orit Strzok, said, I believe that at the end of the day, the sin of the Gaza disengagement of 2005 will be reversed. Sadly, a return to the Gaza Strip will involve many casualties, but ultimately, it is part of the land of Israel, and a day will come when we will return to it. And as this policy is being announced, Israel is presiding over routine deadly attacks in the West Bank, making 2023, up until October 7th, the morning of it, one of the deadliest years for Palestinians in decades, including for Palestinian children. Dozens of Palestinian children had been killed by Israeli forces on the morning of October 7th, before Hamas launched its attack. So that's the context, just a brief summary. There's a lot more to go over, but that's some of the context that's omitted when we talk about October 7th being unprovoked. And what has happened since? Well, Israel simply used the opportunity of October 7th to carry out the policy that Zionist leaders announced a century earlier, which is to continue cleansing the land of Palestine of all Palestinians. In this case, making Gaza unlivable so that nobody can return, forcing out as many people as possible. There was an initial goal to expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into the Sinai desert. That didn't work out. But if you can't expel people, what you can at least do is make their homes destroyed and make it impossible to rebuild, which is what the case is with Gaza now. And they've been able to do this for one reason and one reason only, which is the instrumental support of the Biden administration, which from the start has embraced Israel while pretending in public to call for a ceasefire. The most revealing moment to me came in an interview that Joe Biden did with CBS News 1 week after October 7th. And Biden was asked, do you think that fueling two wars at the same time is more than the U.S. can handle, referring to the wars in Ukraine and the war in Palestine? Now, of course, the question was not, do you think it's moral to fuel two catastrophic wars, but just practically, do you think we can do it? And Biden was indignant at the question. He said, of course we can. We're the United States of America, for God's sakes, the most powerful nation in the history of the world. I'm quoting him directly. And we have an obligation to do that, because if we don't do that, then who will? We're the essential nation. That's what Biden said. And he's right. We are the essential nation. These Israeli atrocities, the Israeli bombardment of schools, hospitals, shelters, the constant terror against people in Gaza, it could not happen without the U.S. continuing to arm Israel, to send it more weapons packages, to veto UN Security Council resolutions, to spin its propaganda in public fora, and to undermine any hopes of a peaceful settlement. And we're seeing this now in Lebanon, where just recently the U.S. said that they supported this goal of a 21-day ceasefire with Lebanon. And the next day, Israel went and assassinated Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. And all of a sudden, the U.S. announced, you know what, actually, we're on board with this. We support Israel going in and destroying Hezbollah. And we can get into, if people are interested, we can get into the reasons why. But the main reason is that Hezbollah intervened on October 8th, knowing what Israel was about to do in Gaza. Hezbollah first intervened by attacking not Israel proper, but the Israeli-occupied Sheba Farms, which is actually a part of Lebanon, which Israel has occupied. Israel responded by attacking Lebanon proper, and Hezbollah then returned fire. But Hezbollah's goal all along was a ceasefire in Gaza. And now we've learned since Nasrallah's murder, and this is according to an Israeli official who spoke to NBC News, that Nasrallah had agreed to a 21-day ceasefire, but he had refused to drop his demand that to have a permanent ceasefire, there needs to be a ceasefire in Gaza as well. And according to this Israeli official, that's why Israel decided to kill him, is because they refused to abandon their campaign to destroy Gaza. And the Biden administration has given this its full green light. So that is the U.S. role in Israel-Palestine. Let me turn to Ukraine very quickly. Again, going back to this foundational word that the Russian invasion in February 2022 was unprovoked. Well, to make that claim, you have to ignore many years of history, which I don't have time to get into, but just starting with the previous decade. And again, in arguing and trying to explain the context for why this invasion was unprovoked, it's not my attempt to justify Russia's invasion. I don't believe in the use of force, and to use the use of force, I think you have to show that you've exhausted all peaceful alternatives, which I don't think Russia has done. But just because Russia has not exhausted its peaceful alternatives does not mean that it was not provoked. And let me just run through briefly the history, and critically the U.S. role in that history, which I think was instrumental. In late 2013, protests break out in Ukraine against a corrupt president named Yanukovych, who lived a very opulent lifestyle, stole a lot of money, but also had the support of a significant constituency inside Ukraine. And in the eyes of the West, he was a bad guy, not because of his corruption, but because he was pledging to his electoral promise to keep Ukraine neutral, to not join any military bloc, whether it's NATO or a Russian-led military alliance, which was important for Ukraine because Ukraine's a very divided country. You have people who identify strongly with Ukrainian nationalism and who don't like the fact that there are millions of ethnic Russians inside Ukraine who speak Russian and want to have ties with Russia. So when you have such a divided country, as Ukrainian public opinion long reflected, it's much more sensible, I think, to respect the differences and stay neutral. And this was Yanukovych's main agenda. Well, in the eyes of the U.S., that wasn't acceptable because back in 2008, against the advice of many of his own top aides, George W. Bush, encouraged by Dick Cheney, promised NATO membership to Ukraine. And in 2013, a very key opportunity to achieve that goal of Ukraine membership in NATO arise with the breakout of protests against Yanukovych. So the protests initially are against a corrupt president who had delayed signing a trade deal with the EU, but soon it turned into something much different. And it culminates in February 2014 in an armed insurrection where a contingent of the Maidan movement, as it was called, which were not tied to the original protesters who were anti-corruption and pro-Western. These were actually people who identified strongly with a strand of Ukrainian fascism, who worshipped a guy named Stefan Bandera, who collaborated with the Nazis, and who did not see ethnic Russians in Ukraine as equal. They led a coup and sabotaged a power-sharing agreement with Yanukovych and put in a new government. And the main party that cheered all this was the U.S., which saw this as a major opportunity. And there's even a famous leaked phone call where Victoria Nuland, a top U.S. official, is caught on tape strategizing over who the next Ukrainian leadership should be. And her choice was a guy named Yatsenyuk, who, it turns out, became the new prime minister in this new coup government. The new government, one of its first moves was to effectively ban the Russian language, which for millions of people in eastern Ukraine was an affront on their culture. And so these people in eastern Ukraine who had voted for Yanukovych, the ousted president, they rose up with the help of Russia. Simultaneously, Russia seizes Crimea, which is the peninsula in Ukraine that hosts Russia's most important naval fleet. Because in Russia's eyes, all of a sudden a new government had taken power inside Ukraine that was threatening to join NATO. And for Russia, it was unacceptable to lose its most important naval base and and a place where many people spoke Russian and identified with Russia to a new coup government. This sets off a civil war where Russia backs the rebels in the east, and the new coup government, backed by the U.S., launches an assault on the Donbass. Initially, there's a lot of fighting. Russia intervenes in August 2014, sends in forces, and this culminates in something called the Minsk Accords, which was an agreement that was reached under the barrel of a Russian gun because Russia helped the rebels, inflict enough pressure on the new government in Ukraine to accept a deal that would recognize some autonomy for the millions of people in eastern Ukraine that wanted to speak Russian and wanted to have ties with Russia and saw this new coup government as illegitimate. So the basic premise of Minsk was the Ukraine would recognize autonomous rights for these eastern Ukrainians, and as a part of that bargain, Ukraine would not be able to join NATO because as a part of this autonomous rights for eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region, as it's called, they would basically have a veto over decisions like joining NATO. So this was the basic bargain of Minsk. The problem is, for the ultranationalists who drove the coup and for their allies in Washington, this was unacceptable. And therefore, whenever the Ukrainian government, whether it was under Poroshenko and his successor Zelensky, took steps to implement the Minsk Accords, they were met with a very harsh reaction. Tens of thousands of people, including a contingent of neo-Nazis, not a very large number, but they are a contingent, marching and chanting no to capitulation. And in one famous protest in August 2015, a Ukrainian police officer was killed by these mobs who refused to have any compromise that would recognize the rights of millions of people in eastern Ukraine who wanted to speak Russian. And when Zelensky took power, he was elected on a mandate of making peace. But unfortunately, he was opposed yet again by these ultranationalists. One famously said that after Zelensky said, "I'm not afraid to lose my popularity," and one leader of a group called the Right Sector said that Zelensky, if he makes peace with these rebels, these Russian-backed rebels, he won't lose his popularity, he'll lose his life. He'll hang from a tree if he betrays our revolution. And critically, this stance had the key support of Washington, which encouraged Ukraine, including Zelensky, at every turn to ignore the Minsk Accords. And this background, coupled with the U.S. refusal to accept neutrality for Ukraine and take NATO membership off the table, coupled also with the U.S. under Donald Trump, while the U.S. media and Democrats are accusing him of being a Russian agent. And remember that when Trump was accused of conspiring with Vladimir Putin and being blackmailed with a P-tape? In real life, Trump and his administration were tearing up arms control treaties with Russia and radically escalating tensions and making things very, very dangerous. So all this culminates in Russia finally invading Ukraine to basically put an end to the war that began in 2014. That, I believe, is what prompted Russia's invasion, not Vladimir Putin waking up one day and deciding he wanted to take over Ukraine because he wants to expand the Soviet empire. And to illustrate that this was a war to reverse the events of 2014 and to end the war that began in 2014, immediately upon Russia's invasion, and this is the most critical point, you have peace talks begin between Ukraine and Russia. Just 3 days after Russia invaded, February 2022, Ukrainians and Russians met for peace talks. These peace talks made progress. They culminated in a gathering in Turkey in late March and early April 2022, where, according to all parties, they reached a very comprehensive peace agreement. And the details of that agreement were recently leaked to the New York Times, which published them in full. And there's a very detailed arrangement that was reached. And basically, the premise of that peace agreement was that Ukraine would declare neutrality, would not join NATO, and there would be a meeting with Zelensky and Putin to discuss the long-term future of these two disputed territories inside Ukraine, the Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, and the Donbass, where Russia had been supporting a rebellion and which Russia now effectively controlled. But the main thing, as a Ukrainian negotiator admitted for Russia, was that Ukraine would become neutral, that it would not join NATO. Now, for some people, this is some radical demand. Why can't Ukraine join whatever military alliance it wants? Well, imagine if, for example, Canada or Mexico joined a hostile military alliance led by Russia and China. I don't think the U.S. would accept that. Also, it's also not a radical demand because, in fact, neutrality, the goal of neutrality for Ukraine was enshrined in Ukraine's Declaration of State Sovereignty back in the early 1990s, which said that Ukraine strives to be a neutral country. So Russia, in insisting on this demand, I don't think was making something radical. It was actually insisting on something that was already enshrined in Ukraine's foundational document. What happened to this agreement? Why aren't we in peace right now? Well, now we know from every single party, from Ukrainian sources, from Western sources, from Russian sources, that Boris Johnson, then the British Prime Minister, came to Kyiv, visited with Zelensky, and told him that, sorry, we're not going to back you up on this, because Ukraine was asking as a condition for making a peace deal with Russia to have security guarantees from the West so that this couldn't happen again. And Boris Johnson told Zelensky, we're not going to give you these security guarantees. We think Putin is weak, and this is an opportunity to smash him, which was effectively an order from Ukraine's top allies, the UK and the US, to keep fighting, and to keep fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. And why is that? Well, the goal was laid out by top US officials. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary around this time, admitted that the goal for the US and Ukraine was not to defend Ukraine, but to, quote, weaken Russia. That was his term, to weaken Russia. And Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, said a similar thing, that our goal in Ukraine is to undermine elements of Russia's national power. And why is that? Well, it goes back to the same reason why we're fueling Israeli aggression. Ukraine and Israel are both proxies, heavily militarized, flooded with U.S. weaponry, the U.S. at every turn undermining diplomatic possibilities, siding with ultranationalists, whether it's the Israelis who don't see Palestinians as equal human beings, or Ukrainians who don't see ethnic Russians inside their country as equal human beings as well. And both of these proxies can be used simply to advance U.S. hegemony. Israel has served that goal since 1967, when the U.S. can't arm death squads that it wants to in Central America in the 1980s because of congressional oversight. Israel can go and do that. When the U.S. wants to give apartheid South Africa weapons and nuclear technology, but it looks bad to be arming an apartheid state like South Africa, Israel can do that. And the same thing with Ukraine. In the years since 2014, the coup, the CIA has built up at least 8 bases inside Ukraine. This was recently disclosed by the New York Times. And the order from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who again was serving under Donald Trump, who we were told was soft on Russia. He loved Vladimir Putin. There might be some secret conspiracy between them. They had this bromance. The goal for Mike Pompeo, the order to the CIA in Ukraine, was to crush the Russians. That's a direct quote, crush the Russians. Simply because Russia is also a geopolitical foe of the U.S., and when you're a hegemon, a global superpower, anyone that can deter your aggression has to be weakened. And that's why the U.S. is fueling these 2 catastrophic crises today, at the expense, I think, not only of the people in those regions, but now all of us. Because in Ukraine, we're talking about a conflict in which the 2 top nuclear powers are on opposing sides with constant dangers. And in the Middle East right now, we're seeing Iran now getting directly involved and all the dangers that entails. And it's unfortunate that not only is there no debate inside our political system about this, but really there's no difference in policy. Trump, running now as an opposition candidate against the party in power, he could be portraying himself as pro-diplomacy, pro-peace, but what's he saying about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris? That they're not being bellicose enough in supporting Israel, that they should let Israel, quote, finish the job. Trump recently complained that Joe Biden had said that Israel shouldn't hit Iran's nuclear facilities. Trump said that's the craziest thing I've ever heard, that Israel shouldn't hit Iran's nuclear facilities. So that's the opposition candidate. On Ukraine, he's a little bit more, in favor of diplomacy, but does he ever offer anything concrete? No, it's just a lot of talk. And that's unfortunate when our country is playing a very instrumental role in two crises that are causing so much carnage and posing such a danger. And I think if our democracy was more democratic, at the very, very minimum, we'd be having a debate about these issues. And that's what I hope we can do here today in this room. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Now we'll turn to Professor Green. Brief commentary, questions, comments.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks to the international scene, my colleagues, for inviting me to comment. I wanted to present some thoughts on, from a kind of political science perspective on the election and foreign policy. But first I'll just react a little bit to what Aaron said. I concur with a lot of your perspectives, I think particularly on the question of the Middle East conflict. I don't see the two parties in America today as a uniparty so much. I mean, I think that's sort of a snapshot from earlier times. And so I don't quite see that so much, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit in my own comments. In particular, I think I appreciate the references to the West Bank. I've been pretty shocked at the silence regarding the situation in the West Bank, which I think of all the zones of conflict in the Middle East is kind of the least morally ambiguous, but nobody's saying anything about that. And to my mind, that's a fairly shocking thing. I guess, and I think it's also your point that the United States is really the essential actor in that conflict, and the one that could turn it in an entirely different direction is well taken. The one place where I think I would largely disagree with you is on the question of the Ukraine situation. I really see Russia as a unambiguously bad actor. I see Putin as someone who has stated himself that he wants to essentially recreate the old Soviet Union. He seems to me very much an imperialist actor. And I think to get to the place where you have to ignore a lot, including Russia's behavior in Georgia and other surrounding states and multiple invasions of Ukraine. So there I would differ. Aaron had mentioned that American politics, presidential politics, doesn't pay a lot of attention to foreign policy issues, and I think that's really quite true. There are some exceptions, and my colleague Rusty can speak to these, I think, better than most people anywhere. 1968, 1972, 2004, basically when the United States is at war, but even then I think the war has to be generating some pretty strong sentiment. So if you look at the question of Afghanistan, for example, subsequent to the invasion of Afghanistan, there were 5 presidential election cycles, and unless my memory is playing tricks on me, I remember Afghanistan hardly being discussed at all in any of those. So not only does the U.S. have to be at war, it seems to me it has to be a controversial war. And the other thing is that even when that happens, it's unusual to see a major divergence in policy between the nominees. Really, the only episode that comes to mind for me is 1972. And maybe this happens in the primaries, but in terms of the two party presidential nominees, I don't think you see typically a big divergence over American policy on major foreign policy questions. If there's one thing that consistently matters to American voters, we know this, it's the economy. And this particular cycle is no exception. I looked at some Gallup poll data yesterday, and Gallup asked people to indicate what are the issues that are most important to you when it comes to voting in this election. And so you could answer extremely important for any given issue, very important, not so important, not at all important. For those who answered extremely important, the economy came in at the top at 52%. 52% of the respondents said the economy was extremely important to them. Then came American democracy, then came terrorism and national security, then came Supreme Court justice selection, then came immigration, and then you had a host of policy issues like education and healthcare and gun policy and abortion, and then all the way down at 14th from the top was foreign affairs. And where the economy had 52% saying that's extremely important to me, only 31% of respondents said that about foreign affairs. Now, America's not fighting any war directly today as we speak, so it seems to me that foreign affairs is even lower on the radar this time. Moreover, we've come through some pretty hard economic times. Democracy itself is threatened in the perception of a lot of people. Abortion has risen to an issue of dramatic importance for many people. And so, particularly in a relative sense, I think foreign affairs has fallen even further from people's minds when they go to make their decision about how to vote in this cycle. That said, as Aaron pointed out, there are two conflicts in which the U.S. does have prominent stakes going on right now, and there has been some discussion of these. One is Ukraine, one is the Middle East. And I think both of these issues have a pronounced, but I would say not a massive partisan character to them. And here's a little bit where I disagree on the question of the uniparty notion. So regarding Ukraine, it seems to me Republicans are increasingly split. There's one faction of the party that remains committed to the old internationalism of the party that goes back maybe even as much as a century, certainly post-World War II. But then there's a newly emergent tendency which is resuscitating an even older conservative idea, which is the tradition of isolationism. That tradition that notion sees little benefit for America in international involvement and therefore pretty much prefers to let Ukraine and others go it alone. For the Middle East, the emerging split is on the Democratic side. Much of the party sympathizes with Israel. Much of the party supports it and does so almost, I would say, instinctively. But to a younger cohort of Democrats, they tend to see Israel as an aggressor, as an imperialist actor, and now increasingly as a practitioner of apartheid. And then, of course, you have Arab Americans who are not a lot in quantity, but they're sort of strategically located in some sense, and they, of course, would tend to be much more sympathetic to the Palestinian people in that conflict. In fact, they happen to make up a decent-sized cohort in the crucial swing state of Michigan. So I think the two crucial questions for this election are going to be, with respect to our theme today, how much will foreign policy issues matter in how people decide to vote? And if they do matter, can voters stomach their alternative choice of candidate? For example, can a liberal who otherwise hates Donald Trump, for example, but is angry about Palestine, vote for Trump? Hard to see that happening. Maybe they stay home. Maybe they vote for Trump, but hard to see that crossover, and likewise in the other direction. My own sense is that between the answers to these two questions, foreign policy is not going to be much of a factor in the election. One caveat, though, I'll mention, returning to Michigan, is that in Michigan and many other states, the election is likely to be extremely close. So even if the percentage of voters who flip or perhaps stay home based on foreign policy questions is very, very small, it could still be determinative. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, in 2016, the difference between the two candidates in Michigan was less than 11,000 votes out of about 4.5 million that were cast. One last comment I'll make, and that is we live in chaotic times, it seems to me, and Donald Trump is the chaos candidate. And I mean that in two ways. First, and even Nikki Haley said this, she kind of characterized it as though he was not an agent of chaos and chaos just seems to follow him. I would put the matter a lot more strongly than that. That's the first way in which I mean it. But secondly, more importantly, I think he benefits from chaos. I think the more people are knocked off their compass, the more people are losing a sense of generalized security. The more anxiety ratchets up in society, the more this kind of strong man riding in on horseback becomes an attractive choice for voters. And so even if the United States is not involved directly, by that I mean our military forces on the ground in these two conflicts, the sense that the world is sort of falling apart, as well as domestically the country sort of falling apart, I think that benefits an actor, a candidate like Donald Trump. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, David. Now, quick comment from Professor Eisenberg, and then we'll
All right,
get
is my
responses.
microphone working? Okay. I feel like so many things are being talked about here that it's probably a little bit overwhelming, for everybody. This semester, I made the insane mistake of teaching 3 courses on the election in historical perspective, which has turned out to be very challenging. And one of the dilemmas when you're teaching that or are talking about it is, I'm somebody that studies U.S. foreign policy, so I keep wanting to bring it up, but it's irrelevant to this campaign. There's almost no discussion about that. I mean, Kamala Harris right now is taking a position on foreign affairs that she could be Dick Cheney or she could be a Liz Cheney. She's just establishing herself as a hawk. And similarly, with respect to what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank, she is reluctant to challenge the existing policy in any significant way, except she's sad that things are happening to innocent people. And part of it is her dilemma that she's the vice president of the United States. It's hard to challenge her own administration. But she's being very cautious about what she has to say on that subject, even though, as David is pointing out, there is a political danger for her, particularly in losing some of the swing states. So I guess what I'm really saying is that foreign policy is almost a non-issue in this election. And I think one day when historians look back on this period, they will see that as amazing that that's true, because we have, as Aaron's been pointing out, we have 2 major crises that are brewing, and especially if you turn to what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank, where basically, whether you want to argue about the word genocide or not, the simple reality is that the Israelis are murdering thousands of innocent people. I don't even know the number of babies that have been killed, and they're doing it with our weapons, and it is actually astonishing that that's not in our election or in that discussion. Not to mention on the side of our competition with Russia now, we're now building a whole new generation of nuclear weapons, making that much more of a threat to people. So in thinking about this, what I was thinking is that I'm taking advantage of the fact that I'm old and I remember what life was like in the 1950s and 60s, and I want to just say something about that very quickly, which is, if you grew up then, the Cold War was a given, and there was really no significant dissent, right? Russia was the bad guy. The Russians wanted to take over the world. They wanted to destroy us. We had to get as many weapons as we possibly could, right? That was, right? And we had to really oppose the Russians and communism every place in the globe, because if we didn't, we would all be threatened here at home. That was the reality. And I think it's fair to say that I went right through my schooling from kindergarten, when my class was reading for MacArthur in Korea, and you've probably never even heard of him now, right till senior year in high school, there was no dissent about the picture of American foreign policy as innocent and as us deeply threatened by the Russians if we weren't engaged ourselves in intervention all over the world. So that was the reality. I will also just say something personal and autobiographical here. So I'm Jewish. My family belonged to synagogue. I went to Hebrew school and Sunday school. And for our family, Israel was a wonderful place where people who had been persecuted could find refuge. And that was kind of what we learned in Sunday school and Hebrew school. And that Israel was something for idealists to imagine. And I, went around raising money to put trees in Israel and so forth, except for one little problem with that. The word Palestinian was never said. not by anybody, not for one day. Was that ever mentioned? Did anybody get relocated? We didn't know. Israel was a desert. That's why we were planting trees in Israel, because there's nobody there, and there's, it's all desert, and we're reclaiming that's the desert, and that's like a miracle. So also within that world and in that community, there was nothing to dissent about. Israel was always right. U.S. policy should support Israel. Conversation ended. And it wasn't really until the Vietnam War that consensus began to crack. And it cracked more about the Cold War than about the U.S. role in supporting Israel no matter what, right? And then all of a sudden, you began to think, as Vietnam began to expose some very negative things about the U.S., it led people to question the whole thing. Did we really need to be a Cold War? Was Russia really out to conquer the world? Should militarism be our priority? Suddenly those questions became real. And if you're a professional historian, it opened up vast areas of inquiry. And less dramatically, you began to develop some awareness within the Jewish community that despite the importance of Israel for Jews who had suffered, that there are other people who are being affected who were not Jews and for whom we have a responsibility. And I keep thinking that because I feel right now that we're back, in the old days. I feel like it could be 1955 again. If you say anything critical of Israel, that means you're anti-Semitic, and this charge of anti-Semitism is being used, to really quiet dissent. Right? Because Israel claims to be a Jewish state, so you have to say there's a problem about it being a Jewish state, and that makes you anti-Semitic. It doesn't. It's been a way of making people actually be quiet. And same thing in terms of Ukraine and Russia. There's no political space right now for that whole approach to international relations. I probably disagree with David on that. For diplomacy to play any kind of role, that's outside of our national dialogue. And so I think now we're going to an election where there are lots of important issues that are domestic, and I don't want to underestimate that, right? But where these huge international crises are hanging over us and hanging over other people, and we're not able to talk about it. And so what I would finally say is that this situation should not make us despair, but it makes us more important for us to figure out ways to have these kinds of discussions and find out ways so that when people are running for office, like all the candidates running for Congress on Long Island, all of them, they're all saying the same thing about Ukraine. They're all saying the same thing about Israel. The only question is who's more zealous than somebody else. That responsibility is for all of us now, is to be opening that space. And obviously people are working on doing it. So you could see that I could talk for 5 hours, but I still have a question for Aaron, if I can. Because one of the things, and it's a serious question, part of how you're tying things together, these two crises, is by talking about American hegemony as the goal. And I'm wondering what that means. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you mean by American hegemony and why you think that that's the central goal of U.S. foreign policy.
I'm a little concerned about time, so as briefly as possible, Aaron. There are other ways to hear more about all of this. This is such an important discussion. I wish we had 3 hours at least, but I'm a little concerned about time, particularly because we'd like to get a few questions and reactions.
Okay, I'll be very brief. First of all, I forgot a very critical reason why it's unfortunate there's very little debate over foreign policy in a presidential election. Not just because the president has huge control over foreign policy, not just because that foreign policy is so impactful on the world and so dangerous, but also because it costs so much money. We, the taxpayers, fund our foreign policy. We fund the hundreds of billions of dollars that are spent on weapons, for example, that fuel these two major crises. U.S. role in arming Israel and arming Ukraine is instrumental in keeping these conflicts going, and we pay for it. And if we pay for something, we at least should have a debate over whether it's a good idea or not. And whether our money might be used for other purposes, like giving everybody health care or taking care of our infrastructure or helping hurricane victims and so forth. And I believe part of the reason we don't have a debate over it is because if there was a debate, people might say, is there an alternative to fueling these two catastrophic wars and paying for 2,000-pound bombs that flatten refugee camps in Gaza? And could we use our money for other things like taking care of our own needs? Should I stop it there? Like, do I?
Maybe so. Such good comments, such great discussion. But I'm just wondering if we can have a few minutes. What happens is that the classes shift.
I got it.
Very soon.
I'll work in an answer to your question when I get a chance.
Great. And we can do that maybe after the class break. So we do have time for just a couple of good questions. Students, again, you have priority. I know we've covered a lot, and I know this is all, as Rusty mentioned, deeply challenging, difficult, urgent, but we'd like to show our guests how smart our students are. So if anyone has a good question, this would be the time. Yes. Keep them succinct, please. We are running out of time quickly, but go ahead.
I don't think the mic's
There we go.
on.
I can just ask. To what degree do you think, this is for Mr. Maté, do you think the...
A little closer to the mic, yeah.
Is it on now? Okay, there we go. My question is, to what degree do you think that Congress reasserting their role as a leader in foreign policy and in domestic policy would help return some of these foreign policy issues and dilemmas to a more democratic basis rather than just have the executive control everything?
Great. Could everyone hear that?
What challenges do you think stand in the way?
Great. Congress, what about Congress? Could they reassert some power in order to make this less of an executive decision?
If only, right? I mean, Congress has, authority over war making, but yet has sort of given up its own responsibility to let the president run wild. If you look at, for example, the U.S. is currently occupying parts of Syria, right? It's almost never discussed, but we do have a pretty sizable military occupation, about hundreds of troops in Syria. And the authorization under which that occupation is being waged is I believe it's either the AUMF after 9/11. So basically under the guise of fighting Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan after 9/11, we're occupying Syria. So Congress doesn't even want to authorize a belligerent U.S. military occupation of a foreign country. It just lets the U.S. take a really creative interpretation of a resolution passed more than 2 decades ago to let the U.S. occupy a country now. So the problem is Congress doesn't want the responsibility. And then the other problem is, if Congress did take up the responsibility, would they do anything with it? In a Congress where lobby groups like AIPAC have a very major role. I think the lobby's influence is overblown. I don't think they set policy, but in terms of deciding who gets to be in Congress and not, the lobby is instrumental. Look what happened recently to Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, 2 progressive black lawmakers. AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby, spent $20 million to oust them and succeeded and sent a very strong message that if you dare to call for a ceasefire to recognize Palestinian rights, then you're going to have a lot of money spent against you to oust you. So even if Congress could reassert its role, it's unclear there would be a change. But certainly that would be better than the status quo, absolutely.
Thank you.
Great. Yes.
Hello. Okay, this is a question for Mr. Maté. So with Ukraine being kind of on a waiting list to join the European Union, assuming that they were able to join, how do you think that would impact the U.S. in its position as kind of a hegemonic power to more of a bipolar distribution?
If Ukraine were to join the European Union?
Yes.
Well, that possibility was an option in the peace agreement that was reached that I talked about in early 2022 between Ukraine and Russia. Russia had no objections, actually, to Ukraine joining the EU. It was only to Ukraine joining NATO. So I don't think that's a major sticking point. And if Ukraine would join the European Union, the problem is Ukraine is a big drain on the European Union. It's very corrupt, and now it's decimated by years of warfare. So I'm not even clear that the EU even wants Ukraine right now. They've certainly made it very difficult. They've also made it difficult to join NATO. They've dangled NATO membership, but they haven't really given Ukraine a path to do it because I think they recognize that Ukraine would be a drag. And so they're just sort of waiting this out, and it's put Zelensky in a very, very bad position. And, you know, just to respond to something that Professor Green said before, because it's germane here. Look, I don't know what's in Vladimir Putin's mind, you know. Maybe he does want to restore the Soviet Union, for all I know. Personally, what I judge people, especially leaders, by is their actions. And you did have, according to all sides, a peace deal that was reached. And let me quote a Ukrainian negotiator who was there in Turkey, who negotiated this deal with the Russian counterparts, the one that the U.S. and UK opposed. His name is Alexander Chali. This is what he said. The two sides, quote, managed to find a very real compromise and were very close in the middle of April 2022 to finalize the war with some peace settlement. And then he said Putin tried to do everything possible to conclude an agreement with Ukraine. So whatever is in Putin's mind, I'm not a big fan of Putin personally. If I was in Russia, I wouldn't be voting for him, if you know. But I don't think he wants to, the evidence to me does not suggest that he wants to restore the Soviet Union. I think he's trying to protect Russia's interests, and in this case, it's protecting his country against an expanding NATO on its borders, especially given the recent legacy of NATO, which includes the destruction of Libya and the war in Yugoslavia, which balkanized that. That's my take on Putin, but obviously people will disagree. Hope I answered your question. I didn't get to the multipolar part, but anyway, we'll maybe after class if we have time. I can. Yeah.
Onward.
Yeah.
Hi, I just have two small questions.
Can't hear the.
So sorry, I have two small questions. For the first one, how do you think the U.S. should balance its global interventionist role for hegemony with peaceful solutions? Do you think it should nominate a third-party broker? Or what are your solutions that you might offer? And then the second one is directed to Professor Eisenberg, but open to all. What do you think is the role of religious leaders in pursuing peace options between Israel and Palestine?
You should answer all of that.
How the U.S. should behave and broker its responsibilities. Why do we have to be a hegemon? Did people vote for us to be a hegemon? You know, why do we need a hegemon? I don't think hegemons are good for the world. I don't believe in the benevolent hegemon, the benevolent empire. And practically, the U.S. could simply start respecting the UN Charter, international law, and join the rest of the world. You know, for example, I said earlier, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, the talking point is that it's complicated. It's centuries of religious animosity. No, it's actually very simple. Zionists, as they openly recognize, I quoted some of them, came in, stole land, expelled the indigenous people, have kept them out, and stolen more land. There is a global consensus on how all that can be resolved. It's letting the Palestinians have a state in just 22% of their stolen land, which their leadership, including, by the way, members of Hamas, not all of them, but some of them, have accepted. A Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza with a capital in East Jerusalem. Major compromise for Palestinians. They're saying, we'll accept living in just 22% of what was stolen from us. The only people standing in the way of that for decades now have been Israel and the U.S. Every year this comes up at the UN General Assembly. It gets voted on, and it's basically the U.S. and Israel and a couple of tiny little island states that are subordinate to the U.S. voting no. So how about, as a solution, we just join in respecting international law, which says you can't seize territory by force, and the Palestinians have the right to exist and have the right to return to their homes and have the right to a state of their own, to self-determination. I think that's a great place to start.
Great, thanks. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to speak honestly here. For educated professors, you all seem to not realize that this is a two-sided issue. Like, you barely even mentioned October 7th when 1,200 Jews were massacred, and many of them are still being held hostage in Gaza. That's what this necklace is for. It says, bring them home now. Also, to say that the Jews colonized the land when we've been there for thousands of years is just plain ridiculous. Like, Jews needed a place to be in the years following the Holocaust, which, by the way, most of my family was killed in, by the way. Like, especially with all this new research anti-Semitism, you need a place for Jews to be safe. I think that there should be two states. I think that there should be a ceasefire in return for the hostages. But they can both live in peace, I think. Both sides have done horrible things, but you can't just act like Palestine is all innocent and Israel is like this big evil genocidal monster, which, by the way, you didn't use the word genocide, but you were very clearly describing things that would amount to genocide. So I don't think this was fair and balanced at all. By the way, Doing this 3 days after October 7th, nice move, guys. Really respectful to the Jewish community here on campus. Yeah, the one yesterday, that was 2 days after October 7th. And right before Yom Kippur, too. I mean, right in the middle of the high holidays. Great work. Timing couldn't have been better. And, like, that Hofstra compliments page, that whole anti-Israel post, like, that was literally on Rosh Hashanah. Like, that was deliberate. And those guys also need to get off their moral high horses. So
I think we got it. I think we got it. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Listen, let me first thank you for sharing. It's not easy when you're in a room of people who probably don't agree with you. Certainly speakers don't agree with you to voice some dissent. So thank you for sharing, even though we don't agree. Look, what can I tell you? You know, I'm Jewish myself. My family went through the Holocaust. I understand and I sympathize with, and that's why I tried to quote earlier some Zionist leaders like Ahad Hayam, who I personally sympathize with. They wanted a Jewish national home, but what they didn't accept is a state that privileges Jews over everybody else, especially if they're coming to a land that already has people, as early Zionist leaders recognized. I quoted some of them for you. That's my fundamental I'm not saying there shouldn't be a Jewish home. I agree with that goal. It just can't come at the expense of somebody else. And look at the result. Can we say that Israel has become a haven for the Jewish people? This militarized state now, I mean, with the leaders becoming more and more extreme, religious extremists. So even from the point of view of what's good for Jewish people, if we forget everybody else for a second, I don't think we can say that Israel has fulfilled that goal. October 7th, no one up here would ever justify attacks against civilians, and there were attacks against civilians. I do have to point out, though, if we care about what happened on October 7th, we have to be honest. It is now confirmed that Israel did employ the Hannibal Directive, which says we'd rather kill our own people than let them be taken captive. And Israel did kill some of its own people on October 7th. That's been confirmed by Israeli media. And if we're talking about October 7th, we have to be honest about that fact. And that same disregard, I would argue, for Israel's own people on October 7th has been seen ever since, when Netanyahu has had multiple opportunities to engage in diplomacy that could have freed all the captives. Instead, he's killed more captives than he's rescued in Israeli bombings. The hostage families later revealed that Hamas offered to free all the hostages if Israel agreed not to go into Gaza. Israel rejected that. And there have been multiple deals on the table that I'm sure you disagree, but I think where Netanyahu has been the main obstacle. So those are my answers to some of your points. I can't get to all of them, but I do thank you for sharing your perspective in what especially when you're upset, but with what you hear. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you.
So my question is one more. It's kind of like two. So one is like in regards to the 2024 election, like why exactly is like foreign policy not really being much of a major factor in terms of something that should be addressed? And then also like another thing is like why is like stuff like it's basic human rights, like in terms of education and abortion, like why are those things like not as addressed in terms of like what was stated earlier about how the economy was extremely important by 52% of respondents, but then stuff that I feel like would be more important is like why is that lower than the concern over the economy?
I think the answer to your question is that American voters largely perceive, and perhaps correctly, that these foreign policy questions that we're sort of heatedly discussing don't really impact their lives very much, and particularly again in a relative sense. Okay, so you can't just think of these issues completely in the abstract, but you have to rank them with regard to other issues that you may care about and may be more determinative of your vote. So, I think it's probably basic sort of Maslowian human nature that you think a lot about your own economic condition, and it seems to bear out in most election cycles. People are very focused on their pocketbook issues. And again, Rusty, I think, can really speak to this. When you start grabbing people like yourselves, right, young men, and throwing them into the jungles of Vietnam and having them come home in body bags in large numbers, then all of a sudden they go, okay, well, maybe that is an issue that I care about. But short of that, they perceive, and again, they may not be mistaken about this, that, you know, it's really not sort of affecting their lives. I used to ask students in my classes all the time, you know, over the last couple decades, you know, how many of you are directly affected or even know anybody who's directly affected by what's going on in Afghanistan? You know, the United States was involved in a war. Our forces on the ground in a war there for, 20 plus years. And it would be rare to see any single hand go up. You know, so even there, in a situation where we are actually fighting on the ground, particularly I think the way the American military has been structured now, it doesn't affect people's lives as much. And so they tend to prioritize when they decide how to vote and they rank issues.
I just want to chime in a little bit with a mild dissent from David. In this way, I think one of the reasons this also falls, you know, number 14 on the list is there's a bit of circularity here, because the candidates are not really making an issue of it, right? If, you know, you suddenly had Kamala Harris, you know, challenging certain aspects of this hawkish foreign policy, then more people would think it was important. But it's circular, because if she did that, you know, that could in fact doom her candidacy. But I'm saying that some of it is how the candidates are handling it, and more importantly, how the mainstream media is handling it. And that's what I was saying. It reminds me of the old Cold War, that the mainstream media is telling such a one-sided story right now, especially with respect to our military buildup and relations with the Russians, that if you're reading the mainstream media, and I'm not talking about conservative media, any media, there's no issue. Like what's happening, what the administration is doing, you know, is basically, you know, we all reasonable people agree. So naturally, at the end of the day, people say, well, I don't care about that one so much. That's not a problem. Let's talk about immigrants.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for the panel. I thought it was really informative, and you guys did a really amazing job. The question I wanted to ask is, to what extent, or if there is a difference being made by these protests, because, you know, as every day is going on, more and more Americans are getting frustrated with their tax money actively funding a genocide. So is it making a difference? Because, you know, a lot of times, like, every day there's disruptions and thousands of people are flooding the streets, but there hasn't been any divestment of funds from Israel, or like Congress voting differently.
I understand why people feel as if protests are futile, and the aim of cracking down on protests is to, you know, just deter anyone from doing it. That's why there's been such harsh repression of the campus encampments. I visited a campus encampment at UCLA last year, and shortly afterwards, it was attacked by a mob, and people just, and the police just stood by and let it happen. They launched fireworks into the encampment and beat people with batons, and the police took a long time to react. And the aim and the reason why I think these assaults and the crackdown was encouraged is because these protests are impactful. They do curb the ability of the U.S. to support Israeli aggression. The Israeli plan was to expel, I think, as many Palestinians from Gaza as possible. Israeli officials openly talked about having a second Nakba, Nakba being the initial expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. And that plan, although many people have been expelled, has not been fully realized. And so I do think that, you know, popular sentiment does act as a restraining force on the U.S. And so without these protests, I do think things would be even worse. I do believe that. And it's very difficult, though, when, you know, you're young, you're going to school, it's already a heavy burden on you, and then to go out and put yourselves on the line, especially when there's so many consequences for it, it's not easy. And I have so much admiration for all the young people who have been protesting. But I do think they have an impact. And another reason for the impact was the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu, when he came to Congress this summer in July, went out of his way to attack the protesters. He spent a lot of time on it, called them the useful idiots of Iran. He said that they're paid by Iran. You know, Netanyahu would not go out of his way to slander, you know, young American protesters if he didn't feel threatened by them. So that to me is another reflection of their impact.
Thank you.
Hi. This is another question regarding the election. So a lot of us, especially those who are like, more left-leaning like myself, we kind of feel, especially, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
With like those of us who also support Palestine, I know that some of us feel like we don't know which side to turn to, and I guess like essentially I wanted to ask, do you think that it's worth voting third party, or do you think that that's really...
It's a very personal decision, and the options are pretty bleak. There are people who argue that the Democrats, there has to be a cost for enabling mass murder, no matter what the options are. So they're going to protest by voting third party that way. But the counter argument is that Trump could be even worse, and he's certainly very tight. His major donor is Miriam Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, casino mega billionaire. And Trump recently bragged about how he basically gave the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem and is recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights to the Adelsons. It was like a favor to them. So it's not a good choice. So, but that's also, it's not for me to sit up here and advise someone what to do. It's a very personal decision, and not something I'd feel comfortable weighing in on.
Can I just come in with one other thought, which is not really responsive to your question? Again, I would say that on domestic matters, there's a lot involved in the difference between those candidates. But I just want to add one other thing, and this partly, I think, reflects the research that I've done for my more recent book, and also the work I do politically, is that what I think is not getting enough attention are members of Congress. Like, I would really raise the question of all these people now, the 4 Congress people that are in power and the ones that are challenging them, how much pressure have they received from protesters? I don't think very much. And, that's something that I think could be much more meaningful. I mean, to some extent, when people are protesting the campuses and are then embroiled in these fights with administrators, well, that has a positive function, I think, But I also think if there was more attention paid to members of Congress and the stance that they took, and more confrontation about some of that, that would also be, I think, a helpful, contribution.
Thank you.
Great. We just have time for any last comments. Erin, did you want to say anything more in response to what our colleagues have said, or anything to wrap up?
Just to underscore that even though there's no debate over, or very little debate over foreign policy, it doesn't mean it has to be that way, and especially since there is a feedback loop. I mean, we fuel these conflicts abroad. A lot of money, resources goes into it. Young people like yourselves are deployed to these combat regions. Biden's been sending more and more troops to the Middle East. He says he's sending troops to de-escalate. I don't know how many times sending troops to a foreign war zone is a de-escalation tactic. I think the way to de-escalate would be to engage diplomacy. But my point is, we have opportunities in this country. We have freedom of speech. We have, we're allowed to say what we want without being persecuted for it, of course, with some rare exceptions. It's getting harder and harder now to speak out. But we still have legally, a lot of rights. And for the sake of, the future of this country and for the world where the U.S. is so instrumental, it's important that we get involved. And especially when all the money we're spending on these wars could be used, I think, for different things that might help people at home and might take care of our own needs before we spend it on destroying other places for a U.S. hegemonic system that I don't think serves anybody except for a small number of people in Washington. And to get back to your question before about hegemony, what's behind hegemony? It's a system. It's, Hannah Arendt has this term, the banality of evil. People invested in it aren't necessarily evil, but they are invested in a system that grants them power and privilege. And the U.S., especially since the Second World War, has just become a hegemon. And that's the role it's taken on, and it pursues that everywhere. Former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson was recently complaining that if Ukraine falls, it will be a disaster for the West. This will put an end to Western hegemony. I don't think it even would put an end to Western hegemony if Ukraine lost the war, but that's the kind of paranoid mentality that drives all of this, and that sees states like Ukraine not as, not as having agency of their own, but as being tools of the West for our own hegemony. And I think for everybody's sake, we should break that cycle.
Great. We're about to close. Thanks to all of you for your good comments. And again, it gives all of us old folks hope to see how you're able to think. And we appreciate all the points of view that were represented. But I do want to say, not every event covers the full spectrum of debate on issues. What we like to think about, that the whole semester is full of diverse points of view. So I think the concern about, what about other perspectives? Of course, other perspectives are important. But again, there's no way to cover all of those in any one panel. And so I would encourage you to attend other events on campus. Of course, our upcoming October 23rd Day of Dialogue, which will be, as it was today, passionate and we hope illustrative of paths forward. And again, I think we all agree the importance of being politically fit. Not only, of course, voting is key, but also this kind of informed debate and discussion, which, voting is when you make choices, but it's important that those choices be informed by this kind of discussion, however uncomfortable it can sometimes be. So we really appreciate all of your good questions. And of course, appreciate the input of my wonderful colleagues, Professor Green, Professor Eisenberg, and of course, Aaron Maté, our speaker today, for whose perspective we're very grateful, helping us think critically and I think encouraging us to also act with clarity and education and commitment. So thanks to all. Please join me in thanking Aaron.